Hey guys, tonight we step into the stifling corridors of Madrid's royal palace, where the air itself feels infected and the stench of decay can seep through solid stone walls. Imagine a young French princess, once bathed in rosewater and draped in fine silks. Now the Queen of Spain, yet lying in darkness, her body turned into a living feast for lice, fleas, maggots, and worms. This is not a ghost story, it is far worse. Because it truly happened. Every bite, every wriggle beneath her skin, was embraced as holy suffering by a court that saw filth as purity. You think you could endure it? Trust me, you wouldn't survive a single day. The truth is both grotesque and tragic. The diseases that consumed her were rare and monstrous, and the so-called treatments were even more disturbing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The veil of time gently stirs, carrying us back more than 4 centuries, to the middle of the 16th century, where a young maiden of French royal blood departed from the palace of Fontainebleau, leaving behind the scent of roses in a silver bath to cross the Pyrenees. Stepping into a world where suffering was exalted and the body meant to be cherished became a testament to a distorted faith. Within the Alcázar palace in Madrid, a dreadful stench spread along the marble corridors, mingling with faint, feeble groans from the Queen's private chamber. It was not the sound that terrified the court, but the sickly sweet, putrid odour, like the ghost of death slipping through the door's crevices. Inside, upon a bed whose sheets had not been changed for many months, Isabel d'Urbaloa, only 23 years old, Queen of Spain, wife to the most powerful man in the world, lay dying. Her hair, untouched by water for 8 years, was matted and solid with filth, lice clinging fiercely to each strand, fleas leaping frantically from the sweat and blood-soaked dress, maggots crawling from open wounds across her neck, arms, and every fold of her skin. She was no longer a woman, no longer a wife, not even human, only an empty shell of a body decaying, whispering prayers as her own flesh turned against her. It was the journey from a radiant princess to a living corpse at the heart of the Spanish Empire, a tragedy of blind faith clothed in virtue, and of self-destruction, exalted as a moral ideal. Isabel d'Urbaloa was born on the 6th of April, in the year 1545, at the magnificent Château de Fontainebleau, a brilliant symbol of French royal power. She was the youngest daughter of a cadet branch of the royal family. Her father, Duke Armand d'Urbaloa, was a renowned nobleman in the French court, and her mother, Duchesse Marguerite de Villeneuve, was celebrated for her gentle beauty and her talent in hosting lavish banquets. Isabel had 2 elder brothers and 1 elder sister, all raised in a strict environment but steeped in the refined etiquette of the court. From an early age, Isabel was the jewel of her family. With golden hair, bright blue eyes, and skin as smooth as porcelain, she grew up surrounded by the lilting music of the lute, the murmur of fountains in palace gardens, and the fragrance of meticulously tended rose bushes. Her childhood was filled with warm baths, scented with jasmine and roses, the embrace of manicured gardens, and bed linens that always carried a delicate perfume. In the French court, bathing was not a sin but an elegant refinement, a daily ritual of civility and sophistication. Each morning, her ladies-in-waiting bathed her in a polished copper tub, washed her golden hair with rose water, and massaged her skin with costly oils imported from the East. Isabel always carried the fragrance of flowers and youth, as though destined for beauty, power, and a happy marriage. But her fate was not her own to decide. In the year 1559, when she was just 14 years old, Isabel became a pawn in Europe's political chessboard. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis was signed, ending the war between France and Spain, and Isabel was the gift to seal the peace. This marriage was not born of love, but to unite two empires, tighten the grip of power, and secure political advantage. She was wed to King Philip II of Spain, a 32-year-old widower cold, reserved, and ruling over an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it. This union transformed Isabel from a carefree French royal maiden into the Queen of Spain, but it also opened a chapter of her life she could never have imagined. In January of the year 1560, upon crossing the Pyrenees into Spain, Isabel did not merely change her country. She stepped into another century. She left behind the delicate, refined beauty of the French Renaissance to enter a harsh Spain, where the body was considered the enemy of the soul, and every earthly pleasure was scrutinized under the stern gaze of religion. Philip II welcomed Isabel in the city of Guadalajara with one of the most magnificent royal ceremonies the Spanish court could arrange. The square was draped in flags and red carpets, with columns of knights in gleaming armor leading the royal carriage, while drums and trumpets resounded to summon the people to greet their new queen. Above, balconies were crowded with onlookers, waving white handkerchiefs and showering flowers in celebration. Every detail followed strict protocol, showcasing the majesty of an empire stretching from Europe to the New World. Yet amid the splendor, Philip II's gaze remained cold and composed, as though he stood apart from the festivities. He looked at Isabel not with the passion of a newlywed husband, but with the caution and reserve of a man long accustomed to the austere discipline of religion. Having lost his wife and endured many personal sorrows, Philip had all but locked away his heart, channeling his faith and will entirely into serving God and consolidating the power of his dynasty. Their wedding took place in the grand cathedral, its soaring dome filled with the harmonies of the choir. Isabel wore a white gown embroidered with gold thread, edged with lace, as delicate as morning mist, and a crown studded with jewels upon her head. She walked down the red-carpeted aisle between two rows of clergy, each step a blend of anticipation and unfamiliarity. From a spirited French maiden, she now stood before the massive altar of a Spanish cathedral, beside a solemn king, pledging herself for life. Isabel knew well that this marriage was a political arrangement. She did not dream of romantic love. What she sought was status, security for her family, and a role in fostering peace between the two nations. As the daughter of a house tied closely to the French throne, she understood that her choices could never be based solely on personal feelings. Above all, at the age of 14, she had learned that the fate of royal women was bound to decisions far greater than their private desires. Though inwardly wary of the austerity of the Spanish court, Isabel strove to appear proud and composed. She smiled at congratulations, bowed when introduced to clergy and nobles, and kept her back straight through the endless hours of ceremony. But deep inside, she felt an invisible distance between herself and Philip, a gap not only of language and custom, but of how each viewed life itself. Philip II prayed 4 hours each day, wore coarse hair shirts beneath his robes to feel constant penance against his skin, and had built an empire grounded in strict piety, where every act of the ruler must serve as a moral example. For this reason, in her early days as queen, Isabel quickly felt the severity of change. Her new confessors were Jesuit priests, men trained under the harshest discipline. They preached that all pleasures of the body were temptations, and that any act of self-care bore the mark of pride. To them, the Queen of Spain should bathe only when absolutely necessary, and each time must be accompanied by sincere repentance. The luxurious baths with roses and oils vanished. Instead, Isabel was given only quick rinses with cold water, hurried and plain. Perfumed oils and fragrances were replaced with holy water. At first, She could not adjust. Her skin, long accustomed to daily care, began to break out in rashes, grow dry, and peel. But when Isabel voiced her discomfort, the priests merely smiled and told her it was a sign that God was purifying her soul. Within Isabel, a mix of confusion and stubborn resolve began to grow. She believed in her duty, in the need to adapt to be accepted as a true queen in the eyes of the Spanish court and church. Yet she also felt the invisible chains tightening around her life, turning freedom and simple joys into luxuries that were now far beyond her reach. Everything became more serious when Isabel became pregnant for the first time in the autumn of the year 1560. Instead of receiving the careful attention given to other noble women, she was met with strict admonitions from her confessors. They told her that during pregnancy, a woman's body was a sacred vessel, chosen by God to carry a life, and that any action deemed unnecessary could harm the divine balance of the womb. In particular, they stressed that bathing was a danger, and that even a warm bath could put the child at risk. Amid these warnings, a prominent figure emerged, Father Martinez, a gaunt Jesuit priest with deep-set eyes and a voice like a passing breeze. Soft yet strangely weighty, he became Isabel's spiritual guide during her pregnancy. Father Martinez not only explained the fundamentals of ascetic doctrine, but also drew from examples of the past to illustrate the purity he wished her to emulate. He spoke of Saint Bridget of Sweden, who once advised, "Pregnant women should mimic the filth of the stable where Christ was born," regarding it as a sign of humility and obedience to God's will. Then he mentioned St. Agatha, a saint who refused all bodily care to keep her soul and body entirely pure before God. Each story was told like an ancient scripture, slowly, solemnly, and repeated so often that it embedded itself deeply into Isabel's mind. She received these words as she would receive the Holy Scriptures. In Isabel's eyes, they were not mere advice, but divine commands. She did not realize that behind these teachings lay the subtle manipulation of men who had never borne the weight of childbirth, yet set rigid standards for the female body. Day by day, the beliefs rooted in her French upbringing and early life began to fade. Isabel gradually came to believe that warm water was an expression of lust. That fragrance was the vanity of the world, and that only suffering could open the path to grace and salvation. She completely abandoned her former habits, no longer looking forward to relaxing baths, no longer cherishing the scents of jasmine and roses that had been with her since childhood. In the eyes of the Spanish court, Isabel was becoming an exemplar of devotion, a young queen willing to give up every comfort to live a life of chastity for God. But deep down, this was the beginning of an extreme asceticism that would, little by little, erode her health, her spirit, and her very humanity. That autumn, the palace was still bathed in the golden light of late-season sunshine, and religious rituals continued to echo like church bells. But in Isabel's private chambers, the gleaming silver baths had been covered with cloth, and bottles of essential oils and perfumes had been put away. In their place stood a small vial of holy water beside her bed, a symbol of a new life in which bodily cleanliness was no longer valued above the purity of the soul, as defined by her confessors. With one hand resting on her belly, still showing no visible sign of pregnancy, Isabel would close her eyes in prayer every morning and night. She believed that every itch from not bathing, every crack in her dry skin, was proof that she was drawing closer to God's grace. No one around her dared to counsel her otherwise, for any objection would be seen as opposing the will of the Almighty. From that moment on, the path Isabel would walk was set a path where asceticism was no longer a personal choice, but an invisible chain that would bind her for the rest of her life. With the desire to become a model Catholic queen and fully aware that her French origins made her an outsider in the eyes of the Spanish court, Isabel obeyed every instruction as if it were a direct command from God. Her French ladies-in-waiting, who had been with her since childhood, could not hide their bewilderment and sorrow at this extreme change. In particular, Madame de Clermont, who had raised Isabel since she was a child, repeatedly begged and pleaded with her to at least change her undergarments once a week to preserve her health. But Isabel firmly refused, her eyes resolute as she declared, "My body does not belong to me. It is the temple of the Holy Spirit." The fear of failing in her most important duty as queen, to bear the king and heir, drove Isabel into an extreme path of self-denial. She stopped bathing altogether, did not change her clothes, and did not wash her hair. The gentle fragrance once associated with the image of an elegant French maiden was replaced by the overpowering odour of a neglected body, mingled with the musty smell of unwashed fabric. The ladies-in-waiting, who had once cared for her with meticulous attention and affection, could now only weep in silence, as they watched the young woman who had once smelled of roses turn into someone consumed by obsession and self-mortification. At night, instead of resting, Isabel stayed awake to pray, her hands clasped, her lips softly whispering pleas for God to protect the child growing inside the unclean womb she believed she had. Fear and guilt never left her for even a moment. In private hours, she secretly used a cold iron chain to lash her own body until her skin bled. To Isabel, each wound and each drop of blood falling onto the cold stone floor was a sacred offering to the Almighty, proof of her repentance and absolute devotion. Yet all this mortification brought none of the results she had hoped for. On a February night in the year 1561, as snow covered the palace gardens in white, and the cold wind crept through every gap in the doors, Isabel writhed in excruciating pain. The sound of the chapel bells echoed faintly in the distance, mingling with the howling wind, but it could not drown out her sobs. In the flickering lamplight, the ladies-in-waiting, panic-stricken, realized the terrible truth. The queen had miscarried. The room was plunged into a mournful silence. Isabel lay still, her face pale as wax, her eyes dried of tears. But instead of blaming anyone or seeking comfort, she believed with certainty that this was the punishment God had given her, because she was still not devout enough, still not pure enough, according to the sacred standard she had set for herself. The confessors, when informed, made no effort to soothe or console her. On the contrary, they affirmed that Isabel still carried in her the vanity of a French woman, traces of a life she had once lived, when she still loved beauty and elegance, and if she truly wished to earn God's favour, to fulfill the duties of a Catholic queen completely, then her sacrifice and renunciation would have to be even greater. From that cold February night, a new weight pressed upon Isabel's mind. It was not only the grief of losing her child, but also a bitter reminder that all her efforts were still not enough in the eyes of God, nor in the eyes of those who watched her with both severity and suspicion. And Isabel, with all her absolute faith, once again stepped deeper into a path of self-denial whose end she could not foresee. After the loss of her child, Isabel completely abandoned herself, plunging into an ascetic regime bordering on madness. Her fingernails grew long, yellowed, curling like small hooks, easily breaking and bleeding whenever they brushed against her skin. Her unwashed hair turned into a matted, greasy clump, releasing a pungent mix of rancid oil and damp sweat. The once smooth skin was now covered with boils and scabbed, festering sores marks she believed to be proof of her holiness and devotion. Isabel no longer regarded her body as her own. In her mind, it belonged to God, to suffering, to the path toward heaven. When lice appeared at first, tiny and barely noticeable, they quickly multiplied in her filthy hair, feeding incessantly on her blood. Isabel called them little crosses, sent by God to purify her soul. When her ladies-in-waiting, trembling, offered to comb her hair clean, Isabel firmly shook her head, her eyes gleaming with unyielding resolve. She believed killing lice was also a sin, for they were fulfilling the mission the Almighty had given them. Her body odor grew heavier, spreading through every room she entered. The fabric of her clothing, already worn thin from never being changed or washed, was soaked with sweat, dirt, and dried blood from scratches. Yellow, blotchy stains became the garment of mortification she wore each day. The ladies in waiting, once accustomed to the elegance of a French maiden, now fought back tears while serving her. For a single breath near her was enough to make them faint. Isabel's meals became equally austere. She refused fine, nourishing dishes, eating only dry bread and drinking plain water. When advised to eat meat or drink milk to regain her strength, Isabel replied softly, like a prayer, "When the soul is full, the body has no need." At night, instead of lying in a warm bed, she spread a thin mat on the cold stone floor, letting her body absorb the bone-chilling cold as a form of penance. On feast days, when the entire court knelt in the chapel, Isabel stood out, not for glittering jewels, but for her gaunt frame and the dense odour surrounding her. Some courtiers whispered behind her back, mockingly calling her a living saint, while others truly believed she had reached a special state of piety, whether it was reverence or disdain. Isabel's expression remained serene, as if those words had nothing to do with her. The lice spread from her hair to her neck. Then beneath the layers of her garments, the red, stinging bites often woke her in the night. But instead of driving them away, she smiled in acceptance. She saw every itch as a reminder of the smallness of the body before God's will. When a young lady in waiting, unable to bear the sight, knelt and begged her to let them wash her hair, Isabel simply placed a hand on the girl's head and whispered, "You do not understand this is a blessing. And so, winter followed summer, and Isabel's body became a living testament to slow decay. But to her, it was not decline. It was transcendence. A journey of shedding everything earthly to draw nearer to grace. She believed each day spent in stench, sordis, and relentless itching was another step on the path to heaven. From a gilded palace once filled with silks and the scent of flowers, Isabel had turned her living space into a personal convent of austerity. And there, within those cold stone walls, a young queen who had once bloomed like the roses of France had become only a shadow of herself, a shadow she believed would one day be embraced by God. After the lice came the fleas. They crept everywhere, leaping from dusty, filthy carpets into the folds of dresses that had never once been washed. With every step Isabel took, it was as if she carried a tiny marching army along with her, and her body was covered in red marks. Some swelled like burns, others rose into tight blisters that burst when accidentally brushed. She scratched for a momentary sense of relief, but her yellowed, thick, and claw-like nails tore the skin open, exposing raw flesh and fresh blood. From there, the infection spread quietly. Philip II, the man who once brought the Netherlands to its knees, began to feel disgust toward the very wife he had once embraced. Standing just a few steps from Isabel, he had to fight the urge to retch from the foul, fishy stench mixed with decay that emanated from her skin. At first, he found subtle ways to avoid her, citing affairs of state, taking long journeys, or lingering in extended prayer. But over time, their already fragile marital relations became infrequent and then disappeared entirely. Isabel, lost in her own world of ascetic devotion, harbored no suspicion or resentment, believing her husband's withdrawal to be God's will, that she should give her heart wholly to him. Yet the worst nightmare had not yet come. The infected wounds on her body began to ooze, releasing a sour, putrid smell that drew swarms of insects. The Spanish palaces could not keep out. Isabel's skin cracked like parched earth in summer, her sores refusing to heal. and each movement left dry bloodstains on the patchwork of tattered fabric she wore. Then, in the year 1564, the most dreadful invader arrived. At first, it was only a few tiny white specks at the edge of a wound on her calf. The experienced ladies in waiting instantly recognized they were not pus, but wriggling maggots. They crawled slowly, burrowing into the fissures of her flesh, multiplying with each passing day. For the maggots, Isabel's body was a paradise, warm, moist, and rich with nourishment from necrotic tissue. Within mere weeks, they had overtaken almost all her sores, eating deep into the flesh and leaving behind hollow pockets that seeped yellow fluid. Isabel neither screamed nor pleaded for help. Instead, she regarded them with a serene gaze, convinced this was the final trial God had given her. She considered each maggot a little worker, sent down to remove the last remnants of sin clinging to her mortal body. When a young maid, pale-faced and trembling, tried to tweeze them out, Isabel placed her frail yet resolute hand over the girls and whispered, "Do not. This is grace." During chapel services, as the entire court knelt, the stench of death from her body spread through the sanctuary. The nobles whispered, calling her the breathing corpse. Some, in their blind devotion, truly believed she had reached sainthood, transcending all bonds of the flesh. Others simply wanted to stay far away, fearing that even standing near her would leave them reeking for days. From a radiant young queen, Isabel had become but a faint shadow of herself, a ravaged body besieged by fleas and maggots, yet carrying an unshakable faith that each passing day brought her closer to the gates of heaven. And within the gilded palace, amidst silk, velvet, and solemn ritual, her figure stood as a chilling warning about the thin line between devotion and self-destruction. Isabel's second pregnancy unfolded in a condition so dreadful that even medieval physicians, men long accustomed to disease and decay, shuddered in horror. The once luxurious gowns she had worn now stiffened into repulsive armor, fused together by a mixture of sweat, blood, pus, and yellowish fluid. Fine French silk, once smooth and lustrous, had rotted into greenish-grey rags, releasing a rancid, musty stench. The intricate gold embroidery was buried under thick, damp, clinging filth. Fleas leapt and danced between the folds as if performing a miniature circus, while lice travelled in long columns from her hair down her collar and into the seams of her clothing. Pearl necklaces, once polished to a brilliant sheen to display royal authority, had lost all luster, dulled by layers of grease and dried blood. Silk shoes, symbols of Spanish nobility, had decayed from the inside, the linings peeling away and mingling with a foul odour so strong that she could no longer wear them. Isabel was forced to walk barefoot along the cold, damp stone floors of the palace, leaving behind dark, wet stains of blood and pus. With every step, these footprints quickly reeked, drawing flies and other insects. Turning the corridors, she passed into paths of death that everyone avoided. Worse still, the maggots no longer confined themselves to the surface of her wounds. They burrowed deeper, slipping beneath the skin, tunneling through her flesh, and nesting within necrotic tissue. Clusters of white larvae writhed beneath the thin surface of her skin, causing it to swell and quiver faintly whenever she moved. Isabel felt each movement clearly, as if an invisible army were ploughing through her body. Yet instead of fear or disgust, she regarded it as a holy visitation from God, a ritual cleansing of the flesh before her soul passed through the gates of heaven. The physicians, hardened by the stench of battlefield wounds and rot, still winced when approaching her. They advised cutting away the dead flesh, fumigating the body to kill the insects. But Isabel refused, declaring that any intervention would defy God's will. She continued to live with fleas, lice, and maggots as constant companions, inseparable from her existence. The ladies-in-waiting who attended her, though deeply devout, had to work in shifts to avoid collapsing from the overpowering stench and the horror of touching her body. Throughout the pregnancy, even Isabel's meals became a spectacle of dread. She rarely used utensils, preferring to scoop food with her rough, dry hands, her yellowed nails still crusted with dried blood and pus from scratching at her sores. Food that was fragrant at first soon absorbed the foul, sour scent of her body within minutes. Some servants secretly discarded her leftovers for fear that anyone who ate them might fall ill. The sharp pain when maggots bit deeper into her flesh sometimes made Isabel moan softly. Yet she would smile, whispering Latin prayers as though each bite were a prayer sent to heaven. When the unborn child stirred inside her, she believed it was sharing in the mother's trial and would be granted a special blessing at birth. In her eyes, all physical suffering was merely a ticket to eternal salvation. The palace, once a stage for the grandeur and authority of the Spanish court, had become a cage housing, a form slowly rotting away. Marble corridors no longer echoed with lively footsteps, only whispers. The drone of insects, and the lingering stench remained. Amid this decay, Isabel maintained a chilling serenity, half a saint, ready to offer herself up. Half a grim reminder of the price paid when faith stretches beyond the limits of life itself. The royal physicians, when they summoned enough courage to approach, could see undulating patterns beneath her skin, clear signs of maggots shifting within. Her arms were ridged with parallel lines, and her neck visibly pulsed with the swell of larval nests. When she spoke, flies would emerge from her mouth. When she coughed, her spittle carried tiny, glistening eggs. Dr. Olivares wrote in his diary, "Her Majesty is no longer human, but a kingdom of insects, yet, against every law of nature." The second pregnancy carried to full term. On the 12th day of August, in the year 1566, in a chamber thick with the stench of death, Isabel gave birth to her daughter, Infanta Isabel, Clara Eugenia, a miracle not because the child was born, but because she emerged entirely healthy, untouched by the pestilence that had claimed her mother's body as a living hive. The delivery was swift, almost eerily so, as if the body long ravaged had been saving its final reserves of strength for this one act. The attending midwives, veils pressed tightly against their noses, exchanged glances of disbelief. They had expected a stillborn child, or at best, a frail and malformed infant. Yet here was a robust newborn, her cry slicing through the oppressive air like a bell in a cathedral. The baby's skin was clear, air-lime strong, and her eyes, though still clouded by birth, held a brightness that contrasted sharply with the dimming light in her mother's gaze. Isabel, pale and drenched in sweat, clutched the child with a trembling but determined grip. Blood mixed with pus pooled beneath her on the linen sheets, soaking through to the mattress. Yet she seemed oblivious. Instead, she murmured words of Latin praise, thanking God for what she saw as divine proof that faith could shield the innocent from corruption. The maggots in her flesh continued their relentless work, writhing beneath the skin of her arms as she cradled the infant. But she held her daughter aloft for all in the chamber to see, as though presenting her to both heaven and earth. Dr. Olivares, though a man of science, found himself momentarily silenced. The scene before him defied every lesson of anatomy, every expectation of disease. He scribbled in his notes that this was a birth not only from a woman, but from a body already claimed by death. The courtiers present could not meet one another's eyes. They stood rigid, each breathing shallowly to avoid the miasma. Yet none dared to leave before the ritual blessings were spoken. Once the umbilical cord was cut, the child was swiftly taken to a side chamber to be cleaned and wrapped in fresh linen. The contrast between the two rooms could not have been more stark. There, in the smaller chamber, the air was freshened with lavender and rosemary. Here, in Isabel's bedchamber, the odour of decay clung to the walls like a curse. The sound of the baby's cries carried faintly back into the oppressive gloom, a reminder of new life in the shadow of imminent death. Isabel insisted on nursing the child herself. To the visible alarm of the physicians and attendants, they warned of contagion, of the uncleanliness of her flesh. But she would not hear it. "If my body has served as her temple these 9 months," she said hoarsely, "then it shall serve her still." She pressed the infant to her breast, the baby's small mouth latching instinctively, oblivious to the sores and discolorations that marred the skin around the areola. The act was both tender and horrifying. Flies circled lazily above, occasionally landing on Isabel's face or shoulders. One of the midwives, unable to bear it, turned away and retched softly into a kerchief. Yet Isabel's expression was one of serene triumph, as though the presence of her child had erased all pain, all decay, all fear. Outside the palace, the bells of Madrid rang to announce the birth of the Infanta. Messengers were dispatched to Philip II, who received the news with a mix of relief and unease. A healthy heir was a blessing to the Habsburg line, but whispers about the Queen's condition had already begun to spread beyond the palace walls. Some called it a miracle, others a blasphemy. Still others, a sign that God's favour had shifted in mysterious ways. That night, Isabel refused laudanum or any other pain-dulling draught. She wished, she said, to feel every throb, every sting of her wounds, as a reminder that her suffering had not been in vain. The maggots, disturbed by the contractions and exertion of birth, shifted restlessly under her skin, causing visible ripples along her abdomen and thighs. She welcomed the sensation, whispering that even the smallest of God's creatures had played their part in bringing this child into the world. The physicians departed in silence, their faces pale and drawn. In his final note for the day, Dr. Olivares wrote, "Today I have seen what I would not have believed without my own eyes, a child born clean from a womb unclean, from a mother who is more grave than living flesh. May the Lord decide whether this is his wonder or his warning." Hello. As the candles burned low, Isabel lay awake, her daughter sleeping soundly at her side. Outside, the summer night was alive with the hum of insects, a sound mirrored within her own body. She listened to both, feeling as though the walls between her and the natural world had dissolved entirely. In that mingling of life and decay, she found a strange, unshakable peace. When the child was placed upon her mother's chest, she let out a piercing wail. As if sensing something unspeakable, the midwife hastily brushed away the crawling insects, wiped the fluids from Isabel's body, and shielded the infant from the tide of creeping life spilling forth from the Queen. With each contraction, maggots tumbled onto the blood-soaked sheets, while swarms of flies thickened in the air, dimming the candlelight into a flickering haze. But this miracle carried a price. The act of childbirth drained the last reserves of strength from a body already eroded by years of infestation. The tear from delivery did not heal. Instead, it turned black almost immediately, the flesh dying before the physician's eyes. It became an open gate for a new wave of parasites. Instead of fresh blood, a thick, tar-like fluid seeped from the wound, its stench so potent it drew flies from every corner of the palace. The air itself seemed poisoned, clinging to the lungs of all who entered. The French ladies in waiting, who had remained steadfast through the long years of horror, began to drift away, their loyalty buckling under the strain. The newly appointed Spanish attendants, unfamiliar with the Queen's condition, rarely lasted more than a few days. To care for Isabel now was not mere service, it was a form of martyrdom. Even the royal physicians came less frequently. Their visits brief and perfunctory, they spoke little, their faces hidden behind layers of cloth soaked in vinegar to mask the odour. Dr. Olivares, who had once meticulously recorded every detail of her decline, now kept his entries short. As though reluctant to relive the sights and smells that haunted the chamber, he wrote, "Her Majesty's body is no longer a patient to be healed, but a host to be endured until the inevitable Isabel, however, did not retreat into silence. She continued to insist on seeing her daughter each day, demanding that the infant be placed in her arms despite the protests of the wet nurses and attendants. The child, swaddled tightly and smelling of lavender oil, would squirm and whimper at her touch. Isabel would rock her gently, whispering prayers in a hoarse voice, oblivious to the flies that settled on her own skin and hair. Her appearance had grown more ghastly in the weeks following the birth. The wounds from childbirth spread like a dark tide, the skin around them splitting into fissures that oozed steadily. Maggots nested deep within, and the movement of their bodies could be seen beneath the thin, stretched skin, creating ripples across her abdomen and thighs. The smell was suffocating, an amalgam of decay, blood, and something acrid that no herb could mask. The palace staff began to take measures to isolate her quarters. Heavy curtains were drawn and windows sealed to prevent the infestation from spreading, though the buzzing of flies could still be heard through the fabric. Servants left food outside the door, retreating quickly before the stench could cling to their clothes. Despite these conditions, Isabel spoke of her state as though it were a divine burden, a test sent from God. She told the chaplain, "If I am to be the vessel of suffering, let me also be the vessel of grace. Let every creature that feeds on me find its purpose fulfilled." Her faith, twisted through the lens of her affliction, became an unshakable armor against the pity and horror in the eyes of those around her. The court, meanwhile, was split. Some whispered that the Queen's survival, if it could be called that was a miracle, meant to inspire the faithful. Others muttered that it was a curse, a sign of divine displeasure with the crown. Philip II, though officially silent on the matter, was said to visit her less and less, his presence in her chamber lasting no more than a few moments before he excused himself. In the nursery, the infanta grew strong, cared for by a team of nurses who guarded her health with almost obsessive diligence. The baby's cheeks were plump, her eyes bright, a living proof that she had escaped the fate of her mother. Yet as she grew, the contrast between mother and child became a subject of fascination and unease among the courtiers. Some feared the child might one day bear the mark of her mother's affliction. Others saw her as a symbol of renewal, untouched by the rot that had claimed the Queen. Isabel's world shrank to the dimensions of her bed. She could no longer stand without assistance, and even sitting up required the support of pillows to keep her from collapsing. Her once luxurious hair had thinned to brittle strands, clinging to her scalp in greasy patches. The crown jewels, once worn with splendor, now lay untouched in their cases, her adornments reduced to the living swarm that claimed her flesh. By the end of the second month after childbirth, the number of attendants willing to enter her room had dwindled to 3. A single midwife, a chaplain, and an old nurse who had served her since before her marriage. They worked in shifts, each emerging pale and trembling after their hours within. The rest of the palace avoided the Queen's wing entirely, save for the occasional messenger bearing news from the court. Yet even in this state, Isabel clung to her child as her sole anchor. Each day, at the same hour, she would insist the baby be brought to her. The midwife, hands trembling, would lift the swaddled infant into the Queen's arms, careful to keep the fabric from brushing against the wounds. And each day, the Queen would gaze at her daughter with an expression of fierce, almost defiant love, as if daring death itself to come between them. It was a love bound not by the warmth of a mother's embrace, but by the shared air of a room where life and decay coexisted, two forces locked in a fragile, terrible balance. In the end, only two remained at Isabel's side. One was Sister Maria de la Cruz, a devout nun who believed the Queen's agony was a form of sanctity, a living testament to divine will. The other was Hannah Lopez, an elderly servant whose fortune, if it could be called that, was the total loss of her sense of smell years before. Together, they maintained the fragile illusion that Isabel was still a queen, still fully human. They wore gloves to touch her, smoothing the damp sheets and arranging her hair as best they could. Sister Maria would press a drop of holy water against Isabel's cracked lips, whispering prayers as if each bead of moisture were a blessing. Hannah, with hands worn and steady, would gently lift away the largest maggots that tumbled from her thighs and arms, placing them into a small basin to be discarded. Their care was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though preserving the dignity of a body already claimed by another realm. Outside the chamber, rumours spread through the court like wildfire, yet the whispers carried not only disgust, but something stranger, reverence. Among the nobility, there was talk of a holy scent, likened to the perfumed air, said to have surrounded the martyrs at their deaths. They said the Queen was no longer merely suffering, she was transforming into a saint, enduring torment for the glory of God. But the truth was far more horrifying. Isabel was dying, in the most literal sense, being eaten alive by the creatures she welcomed in the name of a faith twisted beyond recognition. Her body was no longer a fortress of royal flesh, but an open feast for the crawling, gnawing multitudes she had come to regard as spiritual visitors. Sister Maria prayed louder now, her voice breaking at times, yet never faltering in rhythm. She told the Queen that her pain was an offering, that each bite and burrow was a pearl in the crown of her eternal reward. Isabel, eyes clouded and unfocused, would sometimes smile faintly at these words, her breath rattling through a throat lined with phlegm and the faint hum of flies. Hannah's role was quieter, but no less essential. She changed the linens when they became too soaked to bear weight, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of one who had long ceased to be startled by the sight of decay. She never complained, never recoiled her, lack of smell shielding her from the stench that kept others at bay. For her, the Queen was not a miracle or a horror. She was simply a woman in need of care, and Hannah would not abandon her. The chamber had become a place apart from the rest of the palace, a dim, enclosed world where time seemed to stretch and fold upon itself. Candles burned at all hours, their light barely piercing the haze of smoke and the drifting bodies of flies. The air was warm, thick, and still, punctuated only by the murmured prayers and the wet, faint sounds of movement beneath Isabel's skin. Sometimes, in the rare moments when strength returned to her voice, Isabel would speak of her daughter. She would ask if the child was thriving, if her hair had begun to curl like her father's, if she smiled in her sleep. Sister Maria would answer with gentle affirmations, though the Queen never asked to see the child anymore. Perhaps she knew the sight might frighten the infant, or perhaps she wished her daughter to remember her not as she was now, but as she had been. Outside, the perception of the Queen as a living saint continued to grow. Pilgrims began to gather at the gates, hoping for a relic, a blessing, or simply a glimpse of the suffering monarch. The palace guards turned them away, but the stories persisted, of a woman so pious that God allowed her to suffer in his name, her body sustained only by divine will. Inside, there was no such grandeur. Sister Maria and Hannah watched her grow weaker with each passing day. The flesh around her wounds deepened in colour, turning first to shades of purple, then black. The movements of the maggots slowed, not for lack of vigour, but because there was less living tissue left to consume. The Queen's breath came in shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling like the tide in a dying bay. One night, as a storm rattled the palace windows, Isabel whispered something to Sister Maria. The nun leaned close, and the Queen's cracked lips formed the words, "Do not drive them away. They are my penance." Sister Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, unable to speak against the conviction in the dying woman's tone. Hannah, who had been tending to the basin at the foot of the bed, paused for a moment and looked at the Queen with an expression unreadable in the dim light. Perhaps it was pity, or respect, or simply the resignation of one who has seen the human body surrender too many times before. She returned to her work without comment. In the final days, Isabel rarely moved at all. Her gaze drifted toward the ceiling, where the candlelight wavered in soft halos. The insects, sensing the nearness of the end, seemed to gather more densely, as though anticipating the last feast. Sister Maria never left her side, her voice steady in prayer. Hannah kept the sheets as clean as possible, knowing soon there would be no more need. What the court called holy scent was, in truth, the smell of life leaving a body slowly, stubbornly, in the company of the creatures Isabel had embraced as her companions to the very end. In the summer of 1568, Madrid became a furnace. The oppressive heat did not simply linger in the air, it accelerated the corruption of Isabel's body. What had once been a stench contained within her chamber now seeped relentlessly through the palace walls, curling into every corridor, saturating the stone, the plaster, and the very air itself. Servants moved quickly through the halls with cloth pressed to their faces, but no perfumed water or burning incense could conquer the scent. Isabel could no longer rise from her bed. Her legs, grotesquely swollen from infection, could not bear even the lightest weight. They buckled beneath her at the smallest attempt to stand. Her feet had long since darkened in hue. The skin stretched tight, hot, and slick, mottled with patches where the flesh had begun to soften and break. Her hands were a landscape of fissures and sores. The skin split into jagged maps of suffering. They trembled not from weakness, but from the restless life beneath them, worms squirming under the nail beds, pressing upward in a frantic search for air. Sometimes one would emerge, pale and glistening. Before Hannah could intercept it with the cloth she always kept ready. Her hair, untouched by water for 8 long years, had hardened into a single, matted mass. It clung to her scalp like a dark, resinous crown, unyielding to comb or hand. The heat made it worse. Sweat mingled with old oils, forming a crust that seemed part of her very skin. And beneath that layer, in the damp darkness, the lice had bred into monstrous forms, grotesque parodies of their kind. Their bodies bloated and misshapen from years of feeding without interruption. These creatures were unlike anything the court physicians had ever seen, larger than the nail of a man's thumb. Their shells were thickened and their limbs twisted. Their colour, an unnatural blend of sickly white and rust brown. When disturbed, they moved with an alarming swiftness, disappearing back into the thatched tangle of hair, as though the mass itself were their fortress. The heat of Madrid's summer brought a lethargy to the palace staff. Yet inside Isabel's chamber, there was no slowing. The decay advanced with a cruel efficiency every day. The sores on her body widened. Every night, the rustle of movement beneath her skin seemed louder. The buzzing of flies became a constant hum, a sound so steady that those who remained inside the room for long hours ceased to hear it at all, until a sudden swarm would lift in unison, clouding the candlelight and brushing against the faces of the living. Sister Maria remained steadfast, her prayers never ceasing. She spoke to Isabel as though nothing in her tone should suggest the horror before her eyes. Hannah, unaffected by the smell, focused entirely on her duties, changing the linen, swatting a fleece, wiping away fluids that could no longer be called blood. But even she could not deny the change in pace. The way the insects seemed to grow bolder, more numerous, more insistent with each passing day. From the outer halls, Courtiers whispered of a curse. Some claimed the heat was divine punishment upon Madrid for allowing the queen to suffer so. Others murmured that it was proof of her sanctity, that the fire of heaven was purifying her flesh for the life beyond. Still, none dared enter her room, except the two who had long since accepted the reality within. The sound of her breathing had changed, no longer the steady rasp of endurance. It came now in irregular bursts, each followed by a pause long enough to stir fear. Her lips, cracked and darkened, barely formed words anymore. When she did speak, it was often to murmur fragments of prayer or to call, faintly, for her daughter, always in the same tone, as if speaking to the air between them. The infection in her legs spread upward, discoloring the skin of her thighs and hips. The swelling distorted her once delicate frame into something almost unrecognizable. Beneath the surface, the movement of parasites could be seen, a slow undulation, a shifting of flesh that was neither breath nor muscle. The sight made even seasoned attendants avert their eyes. The lice beneath her hair seemed to multiply faster in the heat. At times, Hannah would lift a lock in an attempt to relieve the itching that caused Isabel to scratch until she bled. As she did, the creatures would scatter in a flurry, some tumbling onto the pillow, where they would crawl frantically until swept away. No matter how many were removed, there were always more, their numbers unbroken by any effort to diminish them. Through it all, the Queen's face retained a strange serenity, whether from delirium, faith, or resignation. She met the eyes of those who served her without fear. Her gaze, clouded though it was, seemed fixed beyond the confines of the chamber, as though she were already in conversation with something no one else could see. The summer heat pressed on. The palace air hung heavy, laced with the smell that had become as much a part of the building as its walls. In the streets of Madrid, the people spoke of the Queen as if she were a figure of prophecy, either an omen of God's wrath or a vessel of his mercy. Inside her chamber, however, there was no prophecy, no miracle, only the slow, relentless progress of decay under the merciless weight of a midsummer sun. In July of 1568, a new horror emerged. Isabel began to vomit worms. At first, it was only a few small ones, thin, pale creatures that caught in her throat, making her cough and choke when she tried to speak. But within days, they came in larger numbers, writhing and slick, spilling out in clumps each time her mouth opened. They slid over her lips, tumbled down her chin, and dropped onto the bedding, where Hannah, ever silent and steady, swept them away with a cloth as if clearing crumbs from a table. The sight alone was enough to drive the strongest-willed attendants from the room. The sound was worse, the wet rustle of movement as the mass shifted in her mouth before being expelled. Sister Maria continued her prayers, eyes lowered, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. She spoke to Isabel in a calm voice, as though willing her to see something beyond the grotesque reality consuming her body. News of her decline reached King Philip II. Though he had long avoided the chamber, fearing both the stench and the sight, he resolved to see his wife one final time. His arrival stirred a tense silence in the palace. Guards stepped aside, and servants bowed low as he approached the Queen's quarters. The heavy wooden door was opened, and at once the air from within escaped, like a living thing, dense, hot, saturated with the odour of rot, waste, and the sickly sweetness of advanced decay. Philip's steps faltered. He had braced himself, but no preparation could have been enough. The smell was not merely unpleasant, it was suffocating. A physical force pressing into his chest, pricking at his eyes, coating the back of his throat. His vision swam, and before he could take another step, his knees buckled. Courtiers rushed forward to catch him as he collapsed in the doorway. The sight of his pale, Slackface adding to the murmurs already circling the court. He did not try again. On the 3rd day of October, 1568, Queen Isabella Dubaloa's breath faltered. It came in short, shallow bursts, each weaker than the last, until finally there was nothing. Sister Maria, still holding her hand, whispered the last rites through tears. Hannah, unmoving, pressed her palm gently to the Queen's chest, feeling the stillness beneath. The flies quieted for a moment, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Yet death did not bring stillness to the body. Even as her heart stopped and her skin cooled, movement persisted beneath the surface. The parasites that had claimed every inch of her flesh did not recognize the end of their host. They continued to burrow, to twist, to feed, to multiply, from the corners of her eyes, from the edges of her mouth, from the folds of her skin. They emerged and withdrew again, as if the Queen's body were no more than a decaying earth in which they thrived. Those present were torn between horror and awe. The priests who attended her declared, without hesitation, that she had died in the odour of sanctity. They claimed her long suffering was a divine test, that her endurance had purified her soul and opened the gates of heaven. The smell, though, to most unbearable, was, to them, a sign of holy transformation, proof that her body was a vessel for divine mystery rather than mortal corruption. Word spread quickly through Madrid. The people, who had long whispered of her condition in secret, now spoke openly of the Queen as a saint. Some made the sign of the cross when passing the palace, convinced that the heat and the stench were not of decay but of celestial fire. Others shook their heads in disbelief, unwilling to see anything but tragedy and the slow destruction of a woman who had once been a symbol of grace and beauty. Inside the chamber, however, there was no room for such illusions. The linens were changed one final time. Though the smell could not be lifted, the body was prepared for burial, though preparation meant little when the skin tore so easily at a touch, and the creatures beneath it surged restlessly with every movement. Candles burned at the head and foot of the bed, their light flickering against the darkened walls, their wax pooling like small lakes on the table beside her. Sister Maria knelt beside the bed until the very end, her prayers flowing without pause. Hannah stood behind her, hands folded, eyes fixed, not on the Queen's face, but on the space just above it, as though watching for something only she could see. Neither woman flinched when another wave of worms slipped from the Queen's lips and landed with a soft patter onto the shroud. They had seen it all before. By nightfall, the door to the chamber was closed. The palace returned to its muted routine, though the scent lingered in every hallway, clinging to tapestries and carved wood. Outside, the city slept under a sky without stars, the air still heavy with heat, and in the silence of the Queen's final rest, the small, unseen lives within her continued their work. Indifferent to kings or crowns, to sainthood or sin, the people of Spain wept openly, convinced they had lost not merely a queen, but a living saint. From the poorest market vendor to the highest-ranking noble, voices murmured prayers in her name. Bells tolled across Madrid, their solemn peals rolling over the rooftops like waves of mourning. King Philip II decreed a funeral of unmatched grandeur. Gold-draped banners hung from the palace balconies, and the streets were carpeted with petals to receive the procession. Priests in rich vestments sang hymns of exaltation, their voices echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings of the cathedral. The courtiers, clad in black, wept into their lace handkerchiefs. Candles lined the route from the palace to the burial place, their flames trembling in the late autumn wind. All was designed to cement the image of Isabel as a woman whose suffering had lifted her beyond mortal bounds. No one recorded the truth that Isabel was a victim. No one dared write that she had been destroyed by a system that sanctified self-denial and punished self-love. Her agony had been reframed as divine virtue, her bodily decay as proof of holiness, the whispers of infestation, the years without cleansing. The deliberate embrace of parasites, all were silenced beneath the sweep of ceremony and scripture. Her life, in the eyes of the church, was not a warning but a model. The court scribes, instructed to immortalize her, omitted every detail that might soil the legend. In their pages, there was no mention of the stench that could empty a room, the worms that writhed upon her lips, the swarm that made her body their home. There was only purity, humility, and a sanctity achieved through unimaginable endurance. 3 centuries later, the truth began to stir. In the 19th century, when the Vatican declassified certain long-sealed archives, historians found among the brittle papers a dossier unlike any other. The petition for the canonization of Isabel Dubaloa, bound in cracked leather and yellowed with age. It bore the marks of time and the faint scent of incense long faded. The documents revealed how, in the 17th century, theologians had praised Isabel's life as a perfect example of holy asceticism. They had written of her refusal to bathe as though it were a vow made in the language of angels. They lauded her willingness to let parasites feed upon her flesh as a triumph of spirit over vanity. They exalted her acts of self-flagellation as proof of her devotion to Christ's own suffering. To the authors of those treatises, the details that might sicken others were instead emblems of grace. The sores, the infestations, the unwashed hair crawling with lice, they became, in the rhetoric of the faithful, the marks of a chosen soul. The imagery was almost ecstatic. Isabel as a vessel emptied of earthly beauty, filled instead with the fire of divine love. Isabel as the earthly bride of Christ, adorned not with jewels but with wounds. The petition spoke of her odour of sanctity, without acknowledging that it was the stench of rotting flesh and unwashed skin. They ignored the cries of servants who had fled her chambers, recording only the steadfastness of those who remained. They framed her life as a deliberate pilgrimage into suffering, as though she had chosen every step willingly, rather than being shaped and broken by those who told her this was the only road to salvation. For centuries, the myth endured. Religious painters rendered her pale, thin face with halos of gold leaf, omitting the crawling life beneath her skin. Hagiographers wrote of her miracle of endurance, without describing the living death it entailed. Pilgrims prayed at her tomb, seeking healing, unaware or perhaps unwilling to believe that her suffering had been not a gift from God, but a consequence of human cruelty, sanctified by ritual. By the time modern scholars pieced together the real story, the legend had sunk deep into the cultural memory. The documents that revealed her as a victim were fragile, almost disintegrating in the archivist's hands. Yet they were clear enough. The testimonies of attendants, the confessions of physicians, the quiet admissions of clerics who had seen her in the final years. They told of a woman whose body became a battleground between superstition and survival, whose mind had been shaped by relentless spiritual manipulation until she welcomed her own destruction. And so, 300 years after her death, Isabel Dubaloa stood at a strange intersection of memory. To some, she remained the holy queen who died in the odour of sanctity. To others, she was a tragic figure, a woman devoured in life, embalmed in myth, and buried beneath the weight of a lie told in the language of piety. The truth, at last, was no less haunting than the legend, and perhaps far more human. But the truth hidden for hundreds of years was that Isabel Dubaloa was no saint. She was merely a young woman who had been taught to despise her own body in the name of God, to let it rot under the belief that suffering was virtue, to trade away her humanity for sanctity, and in the end to lose both. She was the girl who arrived in Spain with roses in her hair, and who died with maggots in her mouth. The most chilling part is that her story still echoes into the 21st century. Today, There are still those who destroy themselves under the weight of religious extremism, women taught to endure, to disappear in order to keep their purity, men and women who starve themselves, flagellate themselves, or shun their bodies because they believe holiness demands pain. The same twisted logic that ensnared Isabel still breathes in pockets of the modern world. Cloaked in the same language of piety that once damned her, the centuries have changed the garments but not the pattern. In some corners, young girls are told that their worth lies in their ability to suppress desire, erase individuality, and turn their bodies into vessels emptied of self. In others, young men are taught that true devotion requires breaking the flesh, bleeding for an unseen reward. In both cases, the body miraculous in its living design is recast as an enemy to be subdued, conquered, or annihilated. Isabel's story is not an artifact of a dark, distant past. It is a mirror that still reflects our present. Her life, stripped of its myths, becomes a warning written in flesh and bone. When asceticism is mistaken for virtue, death does not come in grace or salvation. It comes with decay, delirium, and the stench of a betrayed humanity. The odour of sanctity becomes, in truth, the smell of a body abandoned by compassion. What is exalted in sermons becomes grotesque in reality. What is praised from the pulpit becomes monstrous in the dim light of a sick room. Isabel's tragedy lies not only in what was done to her, but in how it was sanctified. It was not an accident that her suffering was transformed into a holy spectacle. It was the design of a culture that equated self-erasure with moral perfection. The hands that should have lifted her up instead pushed her deeper into a pit disguised as a staircase to heaven. And when she died, those same hands covered her in gold and called her blessed. The danger of her story is its adaptability. The same rhetoric that justified her destruction can be reshaped to fit any age, any creed, any ideology that demands a sacrifice of the self. In the modern era, it may not always wear the robe of the church. It can take the form of cults that control every aspect of a person's body and mind, or social movements that dress self-harm in the language of moral purity. It can whisper in the ear of a teenager scrolling through images of starvation as discipline, or in the heart of someone convinced that joy is a sin. In that sense, Isabel's life is more than a historical account. It is a living parable. It forces us to ask, when does devotion become destruction? At what point does the pursuit of an ideal cross the line into the betrayal of one's own humanity? These are not questions confined to the 16th century. They are questions that stalk us still. Beneath the glow of electric light and the hum of modernity, her roses and her maggots are two ends of the same story. A story of beauty suffocated under the weight of dogma, of a human spirit convinced to welcome its own ruin. We can choose to see it as a cautionary tale, or we can let it slip into the same fog of reverence that preserved the lie for 300 years. But if we do the latter, we risk repeating it again and again, in forms we may not recognize until it is too late. Isabel Dubeloa's legacy should not be a halo painted over rot. It should be a testament to the cost of mistaking suffering for virtue, of exalting pain over compassion, of worshipping an ideal that demands the slow annihilation of the self. Only when we see her clearly roses and maggots both can her story serve the purpose. It was never allowed to serve in her own time, not as a model to imitate, but as a warning to heed. The ending to Isabel Dubeloa's story is not meant to shock for the sake of shock, nor to dwell on the grotesque for its own sake. It is meant to peel away centuries of myth to reveal the human cost hidden beneath. For too long, her life was dressed in gold leaf and hymns, presented as a divine example of piety. But the truth is that Isabel was not a saint. She was a victim. A young woman persuaded to believe that her body was an enemy, that pain was a virtue, and that rotting alive was a pathway to heaven. The value of this story lies in its ability to make us question the beliefs and traditions we inherit without thought. It forces us to see how easily devotion can be twisted into self-destruction when guided by fear. control, and blind obedience. Isabel's suffering was not the will of God. It was the product of a system that turned human bodies into battlegrounds, and human dignity into collateral damage in the pursuit of an unattainable ideal. Through this video, we are reminded that faith should never demand the annihilation of the self. True spirituality uplifts, heals, and restores. It does not consume, corrode, or mutilate. Isabel's life warns us of the danger in confusing cruelty with holiness, endurance with virtue, and pain with purity. It challenges us to separate compassion from control and to protect the vulnerable from those who would sanctify their suffering. In a broader sense, Isabel's story reaches beyond religion. It is about any ideology, be it political, cultural, or social, that convinces people to erase themselves in service of a higher cause. It is about the human tendency to glorify suffering when it fits a narrative we want to believe, while ignoring the person who suffers. The lesson is clear. We must look beyond the stories we are told, especially when those stories make heroes out of victims. We must be willing to question authority, tradition, and even our own assumptions when they lead to harm. And most importantly, we must remember that dignity, compassion, and life itself are worth more than any ideal that demands their destruction. Isabel Dubaloa's name should not be remembered for the odour of sanctity her contemporaries claimed, but for the warning she offers us now, that when we sacrifice humanity on the altar of false virtue, all we are left with is rot, physical, moral, and spiritual. By telling her story honestly, we give her the one thing she was denied in life, the truth, and by hearing it, we have the chance to ensure that her fate will not be repeated.